Good. Hopefully you can see this. If somebody cannot see this, please raise your hand now. Okay, good. Today we're going to talk about the scope, how the scope works on AngularJS. So the first thing is what scope, and then we're going to deconstruct a directive, and we're going to go through the scope chain without the DOM. Then we're going to explain why the JavaScript prototypal it's so important. And finally, we're going to check how this inheritance works on the different Angular directives. And then finally, we're going to talk about how to prepare ourselves to Angular 2, because this is important. There are some topics that we already know. I know this is going to be a long way since Angular 2 is available, but we can already start preparing ourselves regarding the scope. Good. So what is the scope? Where are the scopes? Many people confuse scope with $scope. $scope is an object that refers to the application model. It's not the model itself. The scope is not the model. That's a very important thing. The scope is an execution context where our programs, where our variables can be found. So if we are having an ngController and we want to access to some variables, these are accessed through the scope. The $scope is an object, again, that connects the view with the directive or with the ngController. But it does many more things. It also watches for the expressions. It can propagate events mainly, and we can create more scopes. We can do many things. We will see this later. The scope, I mean, we're not going to talk about $scope, mainly because $scope, as I will explain later, is going to be removed in Angular 2. So we're going to focus more on scope and how it works. So I want first to start doing some exercise. I want you to think about this directive, and I would like that you tell me, or we're not going to talk, because this is a webinar, but I want you to think, what does this directive? This directive, it's in a controller, we can see. It has an ID, which is a select ID, selected ID, and then the directive receives an artist, and it does something with this. This is the full image. Here we have the main controller. Again, this is the selected ID. The artist is an array of objects. And then in the list directive, well, we have an ngRepeat. And we apply some class if the artist ID is the same, and this change on the select ID. So I guess that you more or less can think what this does, right? Here I have a GIF. When I change the selected ID, you can see actually what it's doing. So you could, I guess you could already think, yeah, when they click on one of these options, one of these artists, then automatically this option gets active. Right? We apply this ng class active. Well, let's see what happens. The reality is this is not what is happening. What is happening is every time that we click, all of them get active. And why is that? I mean, hopefully, if you know this already, most probably you are advanced, but some people don't know why this is happening. and we're going to decompose this directive. So what does this fail? Let's see if anybody can raise their hands. No, they are not raising their hands. Yeah, what is failing? We have scope here. This could be problematic. So what I did was, okay, let's do the same exercise, but without the directive. So we remove this directive, so it gets a little bit more simple. And yeah, what does this do? It also fails. For those who don't trust me, I have a plunker, and we can see that. Can run this, and well, it definitely does not work. Or it's not doing what it's supposed to do. Because it's okay. So you can imagine we're talking about scopes. There must be some problem with the scope. And the issue here is normally scope inheritance works smoothly and nobody has any problem. But sometimes when we're using primitives, it does not work. And many people, they don't know why it does not work. They just put this in an object and they work and they continue. So we're going to find out why this is happening. So I'm going to repeat these the same steps without the DOM, without the directive, without nothing. It's going to be directly in the console to the Angular. The first, so you know also how an Angular works. The first is every application has a root scope. This root scope, it starts with the document or the document body. It really depends on where you put. So we can put angular.element document. This is where we get the document. And then from this, call the scope. To make sure that this is the root scope, we can actually do the rootScope.$id. It's going to give us the ID. And also the root$id, which is the same. And if we open this root scope, we can see also that between all the parameters, $parent is null. So we are sure, pretty sure this is the root scope. So we can continue working on that. So our application, the first thing it is doing is creates a root scope, and from this root scope, we generate the main controller. The main controller is done with the ngController directive. And this directive, what it's doing is creating a child scope. This child scope we can create with the $new. So this is what we're doing in the console. And in this scope, we start adding some attributes like this select ID, which is a number, and the artist. And we can see that in this main controller scope, we have $ID, which is 19, and also we have the parent scope, which is the root scope. We can see then the $ID is 1. At the same time, we can see also that there are many different attributes, functions, but because they are $, they are meant not to be touched. They are meant to be touched only, managed only by Angular. So we should focus only on $ID, $parent, and $root. So the next step on this example that we were using before is creating this ngRepeat. ngRepeat is again doing new scope for each instance. So given the loop, for every instance for every object in the array, it creates a new scope, and we assign in this scope one variable with the name that we put on the ngRepeat directive, and it assigns the value that corresponds to the array. I mean, this is pretty basic, right? We are creating this scope, but it has some implications. It has some implications that we will see. Let's run this example. So we are setting all the environment. Now this is one. Let's go to the second one. The artist. Yeah, I forgot that. ngController, and then the new $new. This creates the new scope, child scope, and we have the artist. Great. Is 2. Okay, correct. We can also see what's inside of one of these scopes. This is a child scope with ID $ID20. We can see that the parent actually is $19. This is the main controller scope, and we can also go to the parent of our parent, which is the rootScope in this case. And with the same setup, let's see how this directive is built. We have this ngRepeat. We have for the first row the artist name that we can see here. That's correct, Pablo Picasso. We have to check if the first is active, so we do a select ID. If the select ID is the same as the artist ID, no, it's not. What happens for the second one? The second one is name was Salvador Dalí, correct? And then we're going to do the same thing as before, just to see if it's active. We see the select ID. And this is what it's doing actually internally, AngularJS. So, yeah, active, good. Yes, this is active. So the second one is active. That's what we expected, right? Because we have the select ID is, the selected ID is 1001, which was the second option in the artist array, and for all the scopes, selected ID is correct. Select ID, sorry, is correct. Then we have the click. So what happens when we do the click? Let's click the third button. The third button has select ID is equal to artist ID. Great. So now we click on the first button and we put the select ID as the artist ID. Okay, artist ID, correct. We are replicating what actually we're doing when we click. And what is happening is that for every scope, select ID is different. And why is that? Why is that? Because for every scope, this is a primitive variable, and the primitive variables are overwritten. They are created on each scope. So we have for every different scope one different select ID, and we can see that the main controller scope actually is using the select ID is different. So that's where it is not working. We are having some problems, and this is caused not by Angular but by JavaScript. And in order to understand why this is happening and how these scopes are being connected all together, we have to explain first how this inherit works on JavaScript. The inherit on JavaScript. Well, we know JavaScript is object language, object full language. So when it comes to inheritance, it only has one construct, which is object, and we don't have a class, or at least not in JavaScript 5. In the ECMAScript 6, they introduced class, but until now we don't have it. So, and Angular 1.3 or the 1.4, depending on which one you're using, it does not use the class. So we have the prototype. How does this work? When we create one object, it internally has a prototype link to the object itself, and this prototype it's also in the object, but this is null. So every time that we create a new object, we can inheritance from our parent using this prototype, and at the end it's going to create this what is called a prototype chain, because every time that we access to any of the parameters, any of the variables inside of this object is going through the whole chain. That's why when we create a new object, we can actually use some of the functions defined in the object, because the object is always the parent on this chain. We have this graphic, which is more or less what we are saying now, which is when we have different objects, we can access to the prototype through the whole chain, and access to any attribute in the whole chain. As soon as it's found, it stops, obviously. So this JavaScript prototype chain, I just created one object. It has a number, it has some attributes, a number, a string, a function, an array, and an object. So we do the new. Now the parent actually is a definition on this parent scope. We're going to do a child scope, which is going to inherit from the parent. But in order to do that, we have to put the prototype for this child scope is the parent. Now it's defined, and now we can create the child object with this new child scope. We type new child scope, right? And now we can access through any of the options that the parent scope has through this child. So if we execute a function, it's actually going through the prototype chain, and it gets this function from the parent scope. We can also override the values. This is an access, but we can override the value. When we override the value, what it's doing is actually creating a new option and a new value in our object, as we can see here. So a number is in the child scope, but it's also in the prototype chain in the parent scope. We can access to any of the objects also in the prototype chain. In this case, we access through to an object .a, and yeah, it's actually accessing to the parent scope, and there we can see that it updated the b from an object, the b parameter for the an object. But what happens if we change the complete object? What happens if we create a new object and we assign this to an object? What's happening is actually creating, instead of going through the chain is going to create an object in the child scope, and this is very important, my friends. As you can see, we created a primitive parameter, which is a number, and it created a new parameter in the child scope. We access to the object, and it went through the chain until it found. But if we overwrite the whole object, it creates a new object. So let's do some graphics so I think it will be easier to understand. We have this parent scope, right, with a string, a number, an array, an object, and a function. The child scope inherits from the parent scope. When we did this, when we access to this primitive string, what it actually did, it was creating a new one. But when we access to the object, it was going through the chain and access to the object. So when it's when it is a primitive, if it's a get, it goes through the whole chain and returns this value. But if we set in it, it's overwriting the chain because it's going to create this value in the child scope. But if we create a new object, instead of going through the chain, it's going to create this object in the child scope. Again, this is how JavaScript works. It has nothing to do with AngularJS, okay? And this is the result. Good. So now hopefully you all now are thinking, how can we resolve this directive problem that we had before? And this problem again was because, as we could see with the prototype chain, it was a primitive parameter, this selected ID. So okay, but before we go and fix it, let's see how Angular is creating these scopes. This is with plain JavaScript, and this is a very reduced way of doing what Angular is doing. This is actually my code, so it's not Angular code. We can see that the scope, which is the object that it creates the root scope, it has some broadcast, it has emit, it has some functions to doing the broadcast. It also has the watch. It has some functions there, and then there is one function which is create child scope. What it does, it creates a new child scope, but we connect the parent to the prototype. So we create this prototype chain. So every time that we do a root scope, is a new scope, and every time there is a new child scope, we pass the parent scope, and then it creates the child scope, right? And this goes and goes on. So in order to fix the problem, as Misko said, Misko is one of the main contributors to AngularJS. If you use ngm model, there has to be a dot somewhere. If you don't have a dot, then you're doing it wrong. So from now on in the future, and I hope this webinar is going to help you there. From now on, always use an object, because as soon as you have an object and you access to this object, you put some variables to this object, then through the whole prototype chain, through the scope chain, as soon as we have this view select ID, right, in this example, is going through the whole chain until it finds the view. And why this is important? This is very important because there are some directives like ngRepeat, as we said before, that creates new scopes. ngIf, well, we're going to see this later, but if we use in our view these directives, maybe you don't know, but there are new scopes created. And if they are primitive parameters running in the dollar scope, they are going to be overwritten only in the child scope. So it's not going through the chain. I mean, is there any question so far? Okay, no questions, we can continue. So what we have done here is just start fixing the same steps that you could see before, and this was creates a child scope. In this child scope, we have this view object, and in this view object, we are going to rely on this object. We're going to put everything there, so everything that goes in the scope chain, it access correctly or expected what we expect in the view. So please, no more primitives in the dollar scope. Always use .view, which is .view model or whatever you want, but never have a primitive, because then you don't know what's going to happen inside. So now if we go, it works. Great, fantastic. And this is the actual code from AngularJS GitHub, and this is where the prototype chain is being created. Why is using prototypical inheritance in AngularJS? Well, it's because the speed and memory consumption. The closures are very expensive, and the child scopes are created very often. So every time that we have an ngIf and all these different directives, there are new child scopes being created. So this has to be very fast. So which directives are using this scope inheritance? We have different scope directives that all create new scopes. Some of them create they inherit prototypically the scope, but the directive, the scope, and the brackets, they create a new scope, but they don't inherit. So, for example, we have the ngInclude. ngInclude it fetches, compiles, and includes an external HTML. If we go to a puncture, here I created a directive, which is check scope, and it's going to tell us in the console which scope is. So if we go to console, clean this. Outside the main controller, we can see that the $id and the parent is null. $id is 1 and parent is null, so this is the root scope. Great. The main controller, it has a different $id. The parent is actually this, and we have the artist and the selected ID. And then we have also inside the ngInclude. Sorry, I'm going to make this smaller so you can see what's behind. Inside the ngInclude, we can see that we don't have any selected ID. But if we click here, now it's being created here in this child scope. Again, that's the problem that we had before. We are not going through the chain because this is a primitive. Good. We have ngInclude, we have ngIf. ngIf, this is sometimes is a pain in the ass because every time that ngIf is false, it destroys the scope, and every time it's true, it creates the new scope. So a similar example that we can see. Let me show you the console. And we want to show this bigger, right? So you can see. Good. So we have outside the controller, again, the same. The main controller, we can see $ID is 2. And we can see inside the ngIf is $ID 3. If we write this select ID, we can see that in this child scope, actually we have this $ID 3. The selected ID is 777. But if I just make this disappear with the ngIf and create a new one, we can see the $ID is different. And every single variable that we change here, it's removed. So we have to be very careful with the ngIf also, because it's creating new scopes. Then the same behavior happens with ngController, ngSwitch, and ngView. ngRepeat is a little bit different because ngRepeat, it creates the new scope and it creates a new item with a value on the array. And this is important that this array, if the array is of primitives, is going to happen the same problem that we had before. Because every time if we change one of these values, it's going to be changed in the child scope and not in the parent scope. But if the array is they are objects, then again it's going to go through the prototype chain and is going to correctly access to the parent scope. Then we have the directives. A directive, we can have the scope false. Scope false does not create a new scope. There is no inheritance here. It's the same scope as the controller or whatever is this directive. Be very careful. I mean, this is not a good practice because directives should be reusable. If you do the scope false, everything is happening in the same scope. So if we do the same or similar example as before, but now the directive, as we can see here, is scope false. Let's see what's happening. Wait, let's see what's happening in the console. If we click in the main controller, we can see the $ID 2, but inside the directive with the scope false is the same $ID 2. Again, be careful. This is a bad practice to use this. It's much better to use scope true because it's going to create a new scope and they are not going to collide between them. Again, this is very similar to nginclude, so I'm not going to the example. The best practice is to use scope on the brackets because this is going to create a new isolated scope. So we are not going to collide with some variables. This is a good isolation. There are 3 ways to pass in the parameters, is the one-way model binding, the two-way model binding, and then for the expressions. And then the last is why this is important for the Angular 2. Well, Angular 2, they have some core goals, and these are, among many others, performance and simplifying the network, the framework. How they want to make this performance? They claim that they want to be the fastest JavaScript framework on all of them. They want to do that with, they want to remove the digest cycle. It's going to be very interesting how this is going to happen. Most probably the two-way binding is not going to happen. And then they want to simplify this. And how they want to simplify? They want to move towards components. The future is web components, that's for sure. And Angular 2 is going through that direction. So what we can do already is start using this, because in Angular 2, they removed $scope. There's not going to be any more $scope, and they are removing the controllers. And they will have what is called templates and components. How we can remove $scope? Well, you can use the controller as. This was introduced in Angular 1.2. And here is how it's set up. This can also be set up in the ngRouter, on the UI router, on the new router. And as soon as we do the controller as, then we access through this, right? And then this points to the scope. Although this is a little bit dangerous, because the this is a keyword that is contextual and it may change. So a recommendation, this is from John Papa, one of the John Papa's pattern that I recommend you to follow, is use the controller as syntax, but at the same time assign this to an internal variable. In this case is VM, which is the view model, and all that you want to pass to the model, it should be in this variable. Finally, remove the controllers. That's more difficult. I recommend you to match the controllers with the directives, and always rely on isolated scope. And if you code, you should use also bind to controller. So all the properties are bound to the controller rather than to the scope. This bind to controller was introduced in Angular 1.3, although they improved it in Angular 1.4, and it's very similar to the scope. And then once you do that, you use also controller as, and you can access inside of the controller of this directive as well, with the controller as, and the same happens in the template. And these are things that you can already do now, so you can start working with or preparing to Angular 2. So the two conclusions that I want that you all start using is scope is not the model, is the scope refers to the model, scope refers to the model. And then whenever you have an ng model, there has to be a dot somewhere. If not, you're doing it wrong. Good. Is there any question? You can either raise your hand in the go-to meeting or use the chat. Good. So it looks that everything was clear. Great. Good. Thank you very much for attending. We're going to send you an email where you can because we're going to post this webinar online, and in this email there will be the details where you can review this webinar. Okay, good. So thank you very much for attending, and goodbye.